if you get a knife from a good maker, I don't care who he is, a custom knife in the kitchen is just far and above production stuff.
Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today is something new. We're going to be starting a new series of videos where I'm going to be interviewing knife makers. And today we're kicking off the series with my friend Erich Orris, founder of Fudo Forge. Erich, welcome. Just start by giving me kind of a brief overview of what kind of knives you make.
Okay, predominantly I make kitchen utensils, so I do a whole lot of chef's knives and smaller utility knives and paring knives, slicers, that type of thing. It's where most of my work is, both in monolithic and in Damascus work. I do still do a good bit of, hunting and utility knives, some full tang stuff, and I do a little bit of sword work and dagger work because we all love playing with swords and daggers, Honestly, if you can't make them, why be a knife maker? But they're, of course, not primary business, so mostly I'm in kitchen cutlery.
Okay. Well, let's backtrack a little bit and tell me a little bit about just kind of your checkered past. Not so much about the blacksmithing part, we'll get to that later, but, just what brought you around to knife making, what you've done in the past?
I spent a lot of time studying Shin and Fudo and the Bujinkan, so it's part of why my style is a little bit of a blend or a fusion of European and Japanese styles. But I did that, and I worked in the corporate world a good bit, and I got tired of my 9-to-5, to be honest. I got really sick of dealing with employees and bosses and that kind of thing, and I decided it was time for me to go ahead and break out and go back to blacksmithing full time. I've always loved knife making. I did very little of it when I was young, but I always loved it, and I figured I was going to go ahead and just do my best to predominantly be a knife maker in the future, so that's what I really put the effort on.
And where are you located now?
I'm in Crosby, Tennessee, right close to Gatlinburg and Fudo Forge.
So tell me a little about your family background. You have a really interesting background in terms of metalworking in your family.
Sure, yeah. Most of the people in my family worked in the steel industry because of where we came from. Maybe some of them started in coal mining when they were young. My grandfather, he was World War II generation. He started in the coal mines, but right after the war he went into Pullman Standard. He worked for Pullman Standard. My stepfather worked for Armco and AK Steel. My great uncles all worked for Armco. They're all steel workers. My direct uncle is a blacksmith as well. So second generation from him. I worked with him when I was a child. He still works up in Pennsylvania. He's mostly doing ornamental wrought iron now, tool work for big companies. But yeah, so I guess pretty much everybody worked in steel at one point or another, with a few exceptions.
Okay, so on that front, give me a sense of how you first started swinging a hammer.
Okay. It really started less from interest in the job as a desire to hang out with my uncle. And my uncle was a blacksmith, and it was an opportunity to spend a little more time with him than I normally get to. So I started working for him when I was a child. I was pretty young when I started. I cannot remember the age I was when I first swung a hammer, but I was small. And then I just started working with him, nights, weekends, and summers. And I went through a lot of that. We mostly made tools at the time. An enormous amount of chisels for quarries. Just so many I couldn't even tell you how many chisels I've hammered in my life with a sledgehammer. It was terrible. Eventually he got built up enough and he bought his first airdrop hammer, and we worked on that for a while, and then eventually, a real power hammer, which was quite the benefit to his shop. And that's about where we kind of parted for a while. I went and did my military thing and all that. Every time I was in between stuff, I'd come back and work with him, and I've been tinkering with it on and off pretty much my whole life.
Right.
But that's what started it, was just a desire to hang out with my uncle. And then I liked work, though it was boring and routine and repetitive. It was rough work. But as we got a little further along and we started playing with railings, and I started playing with knives a little bit on the side, he'd buy me a little piece of tool steel every once in a while, and I'd try, and I'd make something that was so god-awful that I'm not even sure the scrap bin wanted it. Probably should have just gotten thrown out in the yard. But you come back to things a little older with a lot more experience in smithing in general, and it seems to help quite a bit with making a knife that looks like you might want to own it.
Would you say your main concentration is kitchen knives?
Yeah, I would say my main concentration is kitchen knives. I'd say it's probably about 60 to 70% of what I do.
And what led you to that?
I love to cook and I love to eat. And a custom knife in the kitchen, just, if you get a knife from a good maker, I don't care who he is, a custom knife in the kitchen is just far and above production stuff. Not that there aren't good production knives out there, but it really stands out when you get a good custom knife.
So kind of tell me what you think distinguishes, you know, a good custom knife, especially a kitchen knife, from something off the shelf.
A few things. I mean, one of them, of course, simply is beauty. Most of the stuff off the shelf is production, so they make 1,000 of them that look exactly the same. And that gets a little bit boring. They don't concentrate on more complicated geometries because, again, they have to make them production. So those little tiny details don't go into the knives because they take too much time for them to make a good living. The steels that are available is often quite better with a custom guide too. And there are companies out there that offer all kinds of super steels and buzzword steels, but you don't get those good quality, simple, straightforward steels really well heat treated and paid attention to from a production company like you do from a custom maker. And then if your guy's good, the geometry starts to get a little bit more fun. You start to see them doing what they should be doing on a kitchen knife, especially for people that like to cook a lot and use pinch grip for cutting, where they start, radiusing the spines of the knives, radiusing choils, radiusing the front of the handles, just starting to make it more comfortable to use for a long period of time.
Talk to me about heat treating, just, for people who are not, super well acquainted with knife making, maybe people who are just cooks that are really interested in stepping up their game in terms of their knives. How important is heat treating, and what exactly is heat treating?
Heat treating is probably the most important thing in the entire knife. I mean, obviously geometry is important. A thick knife is terrible. Its looks are important, but heat treat's really what turns a piece of steel into a knife. It's not really a knife till it's heat treated. Very simply, the steel is heated up to a point where the molecules get in a state where they're capable of coming together to form martensite, which is the hard part of steel that we want. That's what makes a knife hard. At that point, we have to cool a steel, and it's variable. It's so many steels and so many methods. We have to cool a steel at the right rate so that it gets hard and it forms those martensitic bonds. And if this is, of course, really simplified, at that point, the knife is so brittle, if you dropped it, it'd probably just explode. Then to stress relieve it, we put it back into heat. These are much lower amounts of heat, again, depending on the steel, until those bonds relax a little bit. And the hardness of that knife will come down a bit. And when you see some of the Japanese knives and some of the knives that are built just for fish, it's really just going to be stress relieving so that knife doesn't get broken easily. And they're going to be super hard. And they will break if you abuse them and chip very easily. I like my stuff more down around that 59 to 62 Rockwell rating, and that's HRC for those of you that are knife makers. And right there, I think we get the best blend for most uses between toughness and the ability to really hold an edge.
Right.
And then, of course, as you know, we start making camp knives. We start coming down into 55 or cleavers because we just want it to be tough, and we're going to mash things.
Right. Right.
But it's really the only thing that makes a knife a knife. Otherwise, you just have a knife-shaped object.
Right.
And it's so easy to mess up your heat treats. If you're not familiar with them, they really have to be done right.
So how do you describe your aesthetic? I mean, do you start with something ergonomic, or is it more that you have an idea of how you want it to look?
I started out, honestly, in the very beginning, just trying to copy the European and the Japanese makers, like literally just making their knives. That's all I did. I just copied Dead Man's knives. Mm-hmm. And I made them, and they were nice. And as we went on, and I put them in some professionals' hands and in some commercial kitchens, I started to find out the things that were not wrong with them, but that could be better from those people's perspective. And they just started to morph. Like my heel of my knife used to be real far forward, like a lot of guys in the Japanese heels are. And I met a young lady, her name was Megan, and she wanted to learn to cut the big fish, halibut and stuff, so I gave her one of my knives and I taught her how, and she's having so much trouble with it. And I realized that her little hands, the cutting edge was too far away from her hand, had too much moment. And that's when I started sweeping the heels back real heavily. So a lot of this came from, a lot of form follows function and trying to maintain a good, clean look as well. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of morphed into what it was, as an amalgamation of everything. Some people will look at them and say they look very Asian, but they don't. If you really look at the Japanese knives and the Chinese knives, they don't anymore, in my opinion. They just kind of look like my knife. And I was after that. I want to be the person that makes a blade that you can be across the room and look at something and be like, I know who made that.
Right, right. Okay, so for the knife nerds among us, let's get into the weeds here. Start telling me a little about, you know, the kinds of techniques that you use. Are you a stock removal guy, a forging guy?
I do a little bit of stock removal, but really not very much. I mostly forge everything. The only place I'll usually do any stock removal is on a monolithic stainless knife. I do an enormous amount of Damascus work, including some mosaic. I, in fact, make Damascus for some other makers in San Mai. So I'm very big into diffusion bonding, or forge welding, the simple one. I love patterns. The Damascus bug, once you get it, it's a little bit of an addiction. You start chasing the dragon on that and see what you can do. And you just find yourself as you work getting to that spot where you just don't have the tooling anymore for what you want to do next, So, but yeah, Damascus forging mostly. In any forged knife, there's a good bit of stock removal. And of course, Damascus is a little more stock removal than monolithic, because to reveal those patterns correctly, you need to often remove a lot of material so you can see all those different layers coming out. But that's mostly my process. I forge most things out of round bar and hex bar and things like that. I have no issues breaking down stock. I find it fun to do the large dimensional changes as opposed to just taking a flat and putting a point on it.
And how do you go about doing that?
I forge it mostly on hydraulic press. Strangely enough, except for fun, I rarely use a hand hammer anymore for anything other than just dressing. And I swung a hand hammer a whole lot in my life, so I really don't want to overuse what little I got left. So I forge most of it on a 50-ton press now. I went up to the 50 because you can make Damascus on almost anything you can make with a hand hammer, but producing large billets and producing complex patterns and really being able to draw out fast just became so much easier when I switched to the 50 from the 25. You do it long enough, you just start to be able to turn stuff around and make things happen on it. And I don't know how to explain it, but I realized maybe I wasn't a terrible blacksmith the day I realized I could fix things without thinking that I used to throw in the scrap bin.
Yeah, that's what they always say, is the real craftsman is the guy who knows how to fix his mistakes.
Yeah, it's any one of us can make 1,000 knives in a row and throw away everything but the best one, and it'll look like the best thing ever made. But being able to really, pardon me, but screw the pooch and then recover from it is definitely
right.
When you realize you can start to forge pretty well.
So today or yesterday, I shouldn't really say you made some stainless Damascus over on my press here in my shop. Tell me a little about that. What's sort of different about making Damascus steel from stainless, and then just sort of the journey that you went on in order to be able to make something that you felt was good.
So stainless Damascus really isn't any different than carbon Damascus, except for the fact that nothing wants to weld, everything forges terribly, nothing wants to abrade on a grinder. Everything about it is harder, more time consuming. All the fitting has to be absolutely perfect. You can just take a couple pieces of milder tool steel or simple tool steels and set them next to each other and wrap a wire around them or tack weld them and shove them in the fire, and they'll stick. But this stainless, you have to really force it to stick. So everything has to be perfectly clean, perfectly sealed, and then your temperatures have to be right, longer soak times, and it's way more labor intensive. And then huge amounts of time and prep work to stack up more layers if you want higher patterns. And then forging it, and for guys that haven't forged much stainless before, when you're forging stainless, you can't just go crazy on it like you can carbon. These high alloy stainlesses, you have to forge them slow and careful. You can't get them too hot or they'll fall apart. If you get too cold, you'll build a bunch of stress fractures in them. And the hardest part about this is all these temperatures happen on the edges of the gold color. So it's not even like with carbon where you're like, well, it's starting to get a dull red, I have to stop. You got to stop well up in gold. You're still at 1,700, 1,600 degrees, and you're like, I better get off of it. And if you get much over 2,000 or 2,100, again, depending on the steel, it'll come apart because you pass maximum handling temperature. And if you hit them with a hammer on your anvil, as you notice, they don't go anywhere. They just make a ringing noise, and your elbow kind of hurts a little bit. It's just not even worth it with a hammer. You really got to be on a press. And you can do good work on it with a 25 if you build your dies right, but to do the stainless stuff, you really want a little more than 25 tons if you can, at least in large quantities and big builds, you know. But you end up spending about 4 or 5 times as much time forging. You can't make huge dimensional changes. It doesn't, you can forge it into anything, but it takes so long to like forge a point onto it the whole way that it's really just not economical. So they end up being more of the knives that you forge to basic thickness and basic shape in a block, and then you generally are doing mostly stock removal to finish the blade off. Because it's just not worth the time you'd spend. Nobody would buy them. You're just doing it for yourself to do it, and no one's going to buy them. As far as learning it, whenever I taught myself to, and mostly taught myself, I should say, to weld stainless Damascus to do diffusion bonding on it, I just started trying to do it with everything I could find from anyone. And no one would tell you much of anything. I asked some questions of a few great smiths. Ray Rybar gave me some initial pointers, but they didn't help. Not his fault, but they just didn't help me any. And then I proceeded to ruin about $1,000 worth of stainless steel over the period of a year and a half, just continually trying to forge a billet, cut into it, throw it in the scrap bin, prep another one, try to weld it, cut into it, throw it in the scrap bin, literally $1,000 worth of stainless steel. And then I called Ray, and he gave me one little hint that didn't mean anything in the beginning, and at that point, it just made everything click. And I can't tell you what the revelation was. That's the worst part. But I went back out and I did the next one, and it welded, and the one after that didn't. And from there on out, I've just been able to diffusion bond almost everything as long as I pay enough attention.
That's great. So a customer comes to you to get a custom chef's knife, let's say, and they say, well, pitch me the difference between carbon steel and stainless steel. What are you going to tell them?
Oh, I mean, I'm very much a lover of carbon. I love the patinas that come into carbon. I love how easy they are to sharpen. I think that most of the time it's a better knife. The problem with carbon is just really simply this. You have to take care of it all the time. And I don't mind doing that in my own kitchen. You know, I'll go cut stuff and I'll wash the knife and dry it off and hang it back on the magnet and then continue what I'm doing. If you don't do that, you'll just wreck the thing really fast. And stainless, that won't happen to. You know, the stainless knives, you pretty much can just treat them like a production knife, other than the fact that you don't really want to put them in a dishwasher because it does damage epoxy and damage wooden handles. They'll hold together, they just get really ugly fast. I almost will never make someone a set of steak knives in anything other than stainless unless they repeatedly ask me to do it in carbon, because again, like I said, I don't mind cleaning a knife and drying it right while I'm cooking because I'm still in the kitchen, I'm talking. But by the time we sit down and we have a couple of beers or a glass of wine and we eat dinner and we have our steaks, I kind of just want to throw my steak knives on the counter and forget about them until tomorrow.
Right.
And if they're carbon, you'll just come back to a ball of rust. That said, there's a lot of stainlesses that will take fabulous edges, just as good or better than a lot of the carbon steels. They just all tend to be much more difficult to sharpen, especially for the home chef that wants to sharpen their own blades, because there's nothing like being able to touch up your own blade in the kitchen quickly. It doesn't want to have to buy a whole bunch of crazy stones and spend a lot of time learning how to sharpen to get good. Because you sharpen some of these crazy stainlesses, and some of them, you can't even feel anything on the stone. You're like, I'm on a 220 grit stone, you feel like you're on ice. They're so abrasion resistant, so. Yeah.
Okay, so somebody wants to get a knife from you, how do they go about doing it?
Well, I mean, they can, of course, contact me through my website.
Which is?
www.fudoforge.com, F-U-D-O-F-O-R-G. And I'm happy to take custom orders that way. I do keep quite a bit on that website too, most of the time. I try to have some good inventory. It gets a little light sometimes, but I'm a pretty prolific knife maker, so there's usually a good bit up. And of course, they're welcome to stop by my shop in Cosby if they're in the area. I do have a little showroom there. See the blacksmith shop.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
You're going to be at the Blade Show.
I will be at the Blade Show. I do not remember my table number, but I'm in the main room somewhere.
Well, we'll try and put it in the link down below if we can track that down. Any other social media contacts that? Yeah,
I'm on Instagram and Facebook. Again, both under Fudo Forge. Pretty easy to find. It's a unique enough name that pops up in a search pretty easily.
Right. Well, anything just generally that you think is worth mentioning about you or your work that we haven't gotten to yet?
That's a really rough question. I'm better at self-flagellating than I am at self-grandizing. I'm more likely to be, well, that was okay. Not, I made the best knife in the world.
Well, actually, that introduces something that's interesting to me, which is, a lot of people sort of feel like, well, I saw this knife maker on YouTube or something, they must know everything. And I think all of those of us who are in the trade always feel like we don't know enough. So how do you go about kind of continuing to learn and upping your game?
I'm always trying to get one level up or get my finish a little better, figure out a new process, add new materials. And it's difficult. It really is. I used to feel like I knew a lot, and I'm sure I do know a lot. But every day I work on something, I feel like I know a little bit less. And I know sometimes with younger knife makers, that makes them feel like I'm being, ridiculous or something, but I don't mean it that way. Obviously, we're all at a different point in our journey, but as you go along and you start getting better and better at this, you start realizing how many industrial processes are out there that we know as humankind. The things that we can do as humankind, but there's like two guys in one steel mill in one place that know how to do that one operation that you need, but you have to pair it with this other operation that's done at another steel mill 3,000 miles away, and he only speaks Norwegian. And neither one of them knows how this goes together, because while they're extremely smart and they know absolutely what they're doing, no one in industry tries to do the things we do as custom knife makers. They didn't figure we were going to take 15 and 20 saw steel and some 1095 spring steel and smash them together to make a pattern. We just made them for their purposes. And when you ask the metallurgist questions, I've sometimes talked to some of these metallurgists, and these are guys with, they make big money, really smart. They know steel so well, they make me look like a moron. And I'll ask them a question, they're like, I don't know, let me know how it turns out. And you got to make sure if a guy gives you that, you do call him back and let him know how it turns out, because most of them are super interested, and it's just not what they're paid for, so you're not going to mess with it. But yeah, I just keep trying to try new things, and unfortunately, you have to self-teach yourself a lot. There's a lot of information out there now. There's a lot of stuff to get guys started. You can become a fabulous knife maker with a little practice, getting with a couple of guys that know what they're doing, and just research and books, and you can time and grade. But as you start to get towards the upper crust of what's going on right now, no one else hardly knows what they're doing either. We're all just trying to figure it out as we go along. And some guys are really nice and they'll just absolutely stop and just show you exactly how to do what you're having trouble with, and some guys won't tell you crap about the stuff that they're working on that's difficult. So you've really got to learn to be a self-learner. You really do, and you have to be willing to experiment and fail. When we were talking about me trying to teach myself how to make stainless Damascus with a little help from others, I was so disheartened through that entire process, it was hard for me to even make anything else. Because it was just failure after failure after failure. And I'm literally talking for a year and a half, Walter. By the time I was towards the end of it, I just felt like I couldn't forge, I couldn't make a knife. I probably was a horrible person, Melissa didn't love me, someone's gonna take my house, my car sucks. I was just down, so just constant failure, and you really have to be able to just plow through that repetitious failure.
Just extend that a little bit for folks that might be, just getting started in knife making, or even just thinking about knife making. What kind of path do you think they need to travel down, or what kind of mindset do they need to have in order to learn this stuff? Well,
I think they need to be open-minded and not expect to come out of the gate. Maybe even not making a successful knife that works well. The tools that they can gather, they should gather. But as we know, and as you've gone over a few times, it doesn't take that much to make a basic knife. And then you just got to kind of start doing it and accept the fact that they're not all going to be great. And accept the fact that your mama and your friends are all going to tell you that they're gorgeous and they're perfect and they love them because they love you and they want you to feel good about yourself. And you should. I had a gentleman, Bert Foster, tell me that you should be your second worst critic. but never your first worst critic. But, you know, my mom loves everything I've ever made. And some of the stuff I made when I was younger and even earlier on when I started into knife making and decided it was going to be full time, it's embarrassing, Walter. Like, I would buy some of these knives back from people just to get them out of the market so no one ever saw them. And it's going to be that way for a little while. And you just keep making them, and you know eventually you're going to need something. Like, you're going to be, I really need a 2x72 grinder to do any good work. And, you know, just keep in mind, if you can sell $10, $100 knives, you can get a basic 2x72 grinder, and you just have to start doing that the grassroots old way, like everyone did. With the new world, we don't have all these multi-generational blacksmith shops, and that's one benefit that I had. You know, I have an uncle that spent his life building his tooling. It's fabulous, and so I have good access to tools, and I had help coming up, and I got to use those tools. And in the old world, you'd grow up in a blacksmith shop, and then dad or uncle or shop master would pass on, and it'd be your shop, and all the tools came with it. And we just don't have that anymore, so you just gotta fight through the little things you have. Right. And just keep making knives, and if it's not fun for you, it's really not worth doing.
All right, that'll about wrap it up, Eric. Thanks for stopping by the shop. Really, it's been a great talk. So, guys, I also want to thank you for sticking with us here. Check out his website, fudoforge.com. Eric's knives are really beautiful, and you'd really be well rewarded by picking up one for your kitchen. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.